what I'd like to do is touch a little bit more about the sensory eating aspect to this. Like, what do you see in a child and a teen? How are they presenting and how do they live their life with that?
Similarly to your experience, the vast majority of the clients I work with are also clients that have that sensory element and a lot of food rules, but there seems to be this underlying feeling of disgust in reaction to food. And that's a big challenge. Disgust is different from anxiety because disgust is a very hardwired emotion that tells us something is dangerous. And especially when it comes to food, it's signaling that that food may be poisoned. And that's an evolutionary experience. So it makes sense that we would avoid foods that are experienced as disgusting. And there's a suggested component to this, that this is how people are built that struggle with ARFID. And it's not necessarily something we can change. They may always find certain foods to be disgusting, but there are different ways to approach it that can help alleviate some of that disgust. And sometimes by trying new foods, you do realize you like them, and maybe you've avoided things for so long that you didn't even realize you could like them. You were just afraid of it. But I want to acknowledge that folks who struggle with ARFID may have this built-in sensory sensitivity or textural sensitivity or just disgust reaction. And there is some research that suggests that a subset of folks who have ARFID may be super tasters, where they have a higher concentration of taste buds in certain areas and I'm talking a little bit outside of my, domain.
This is awesome though, because for me, I see these challenges that kids have because SM is so much more than not speaking, and these different comorbidities and challenges. And so to hear you kind of go into more elaboration in this is such a benefit, frankly, to me, but also to our listeners.
And something that's really important to me is validating that experience is very real. And that we're not trying to ruin their lives by making them eat disgusting things so much as helping somebody work through feelings of disgust so that they can live a fuller life in a way that makes sense to their goals. And that's one of the reasons I really like working with teens and adults is they have a lot more agency and say in what their goals really are. But often the goals are not to love food or even like food. The goal is to be able to eat across different settings or to be able to eat a variety of foods so that they can get adequate nutrition and address any medical consequences of food. And so we're looking at what is the point of this? Is it to make them comfortable with food? To an extent, but it's more about if you are comfortable with eating food, what would that give you on a larger scale? And in terms of how this can shift with treatment, often people who have that sensory origin or that disgust reaction will be born that way. They are built that way. And then they start cutting out foods or they don't try foods. And one way of thinking about this is you often develop what you think tastes good based off of what you are exposed to, especially early on. So you look at cultural differences in what we find to be good foods and what do we eat. And people tend to prefer different spices and flavors that they grew up with because your palate adapts to that. So somebody might have a sensory sensitivity or a disgust reaction to certain foods, but then also if they're not exposed to foods, foods will taste more disgusting over time. And by practicing engaging with foods, sometimes you can dismantle some of those disgust reactions just through the experience and adapting your palate to those different kinds of foods.
So it's interesting you say disgust, because disgust for littler kids is not the biggest thing that I see. I just see kids avoiding certain foods and the kind of power struggle that exists with parents. They need to eat this much. They're not eating. They stopped eating. Now, as we know, developmentally, they change, right? Their nutritional needs change. So their high demand nutrition and eating a lot will change as they age. So I see that. So I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear your thought on this. And I'm just thinking outside the box here. I'm wondering if the word disgust comes about more as kids get older and it looks like disgust, but maybe it started out as a real sensitivity. Because in young children, I never hear that term. It's disgusting, mom. I never hear it, or I don't like. It's more of like, oh, it almost bothers them to eat it. So then it turns into disgust. What's your thought on that?
I could see it going a lot of different directions, and I don't know the exact answer to that. And I don't know if it's a lack of language at that stage, or if it's something that, gets reinforced. And I think that there's both. I think some people, the more they avoid it, the more they have an association with it. And that's where the psychological therapy side of things can really help, because we counter condition some of those strong emotional reactions to the food that have built up over time. But also, there seems to be this, for a lot of the clients that I work with, you'll just see this automatic disgust reaction where they'll bite into food and just look repulsed. And you can see they're fighting the urge to spit it out, and they're fighting the urge to gag on it. And that's with adults and, older clients that I work with who are very aware of what they're doing. They are choosing to be there. They want to engage with that food. And a lot of times they'll go into it saying, yeah, I can totally do that. And then when they take the first bite, you just see that revulsion and they're like, oh, maybe I can't do this. What do I do with this? And sometimes it's the flavor. Sometimes it's just the texture. I've worked with people who struggle with like bursting sensations when you bite into a food and it's bursting. And so we'll practice just biting into a grape and spitting it out, and biting into a grape and spitting it out, just to work through that sensation of, okay, I can handle this. I do not like this. This is not my favorite, but I can totally handle this. And then feeling confident to be able to bite into things. And even if you have that disgust reaction or that revulsion, you can work through that feeling. And sometimes you can retrain that reaction. So that's where I'm wondering about your question of, is it something that develops over time? Some people can't retrain it, but some people I've worked with are able to kind of dial it down once they've gotten used to eating certain textures, even if they don't like them.
And so interesting, what I find with kids with sensory issues, there's a lot of children that might present, let's say 3, 4, 5, with a lot more sensory sensitivities, not just with eating, with other aspects of sensory sensitivities. They're often affected with visual processing, auditory processing. They get very, they shut down in loud, large, lots of people environments. And then I rarely have ever had a case where you have just the, kind of the loud, large, lots of people and not have picky eating. It all goes together. Picky eaters and also difficulty regulating emotions. So we see all that. But it's really interesting too, because as children age, I often say to some of the families, many of these kids are growing into their more immature sensory system. So the child at 3 or 4 or 5 may look very different at 7, 8, or 9. And some of those earlier sensory sensitivities and almost learned conditioned behaviors surrounding those originally more upsetting sensory sensitivities that cause them so much dysfunction aren't so much causing the dysfunction now, but they're learned behaviors, parents' learned reactions. So again, I wasn't necessarily planning to say all of this, but as you're talking to me, all these things pop into my head, regarding my population. So with what I just said, does that make you think of anything? Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And I think that starts to be the question of, how is ARFID diagnostically? Is it its own thing? Are the subcategories something else? Are they related to other diagnoses? And I certainly work with a lot of folks who have other sensory sensitivities. And then it starts to become this broader question of, what else is happening? Is there something in the way that they're built in terms of how they're experiencing sensory information? Is there something in terms of like neurological mapping and how much real estate is being dedicated to each of those sensory modalities? And then trying to figure out, how much should we be accommodating and helping somebody, navigate and drown out in terms of sensory overload so that they can live a full life while accommodating that, versus how much should we be helping somebody work through it and push them to face some of these avoided experiences so that they can learn how to handle them. And I think it's always this fine line of working with the individual to figure out what their goals are, what are they hoping to get out of life, so that we're helping them go towards things that are helpful for them to go towards, and then accommodating things that might be helpful to accommodate as a kind person, helping them live through the world. I know that was kind of a murky response, but
that makes sense. That makes sense. But it's interesting for me. One of the lectures or workshops I do is selective mutism through the ages, because I see the 2.5, 3-year-olds all the way up to, older adults. So to see how social communication changes over time, I imagine it's very similar when you're really, and I see it with like eating issues and how things change too. So I think it's just interesting to see kind of that hear about those dynamics that on your end too.